Once again, welcome everyone to the Agroecology webinar series. My name is Evelyn Zuniga, and I am one of the communications officers for the Agroecology Partnership Project. If you have been here before, then you know that the Agroecology Partnership officially started in 2024, and it's funded under the Horizon Europe program. It currently unites the European Commission and 72 partners across 26 member states, associated countries, and third countries. This partnership seeks to support the agriculture sector to meet the targets and challenges from climate change, biodiversity loss, food security and sovereignty, and the environment. The partnership combines the resources of the European Commission and the participant countries to fund advanced research that generates essential knowledge and innovative technologies that closely align with its primary themes and goals. In this webinar series, this is the first webinar for the agroecology crop series. And throughout this series, we're going to explore practices, challenges, and innovations that contribute to maintaining healthy and productive crops for resilient ecosystems. Um, Today, we are I know, just a few housekeeping announcements. Please feel free to uh, type your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box that I have enabled for everyone. I'm going to do my best to address as many questions as possible with the time that we have, which is around a total of 45 minutes. Today, we are very fortunate to have Professor Per Kudsk, who is currently working as a professor at the Department of Agroecology and Crop Health in Aarhus University in Denmark. So let me share my screen a second. It's coming. Perfect. Professor Kutsch's research interests circle around integrated weed management, herbicide resistance, and sustainable crop protection, and the environmental factors influencing herbicide performance. He's the editor of the book Advances in Integrated Weed Management and has authored several papers on glyphosate use, pest management transformation, and crop protection policy. His work bridges the gap between science, on-the-ground farming practices, and policymaking, shaping the future of European agriculture. Today, the title of his project is Integrated Weed Management Solution: Practical Implementations and Solutions for Europe, which is part of the IWM Praise project funded by Horizon 2020. Professor Kudsk, thank you very much for joining us today in our webinar series. We are very fortunate to have you. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing your presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the invitation to give this now have been, as I know, have been followed up by several projects on integrated weed management. But at that time, it was actually the first EU research and innovation project dealing or focusing solely on integrated weed management. What I'm going to do today is to give you an overview of the project, how we actually approached the task of developing integrated weed management practices, and also giving you an overview about the outcome of the project, because I think I'm personally quite proud about the project. I think there was a lot of very, very interesting outputs which are still available and which could benefit practical farming, but could also maybe benefit the ongoing projects on integrated weed management. Now, the IWMPRAISE project had partners from 8 countries, but a very relatively big project with a number of partners, because in each of the participating countries, we did not only include research stations, institutes, we also included advisory services, farmers' organizations, and small and medium enterprises, producing some of the tools of the future for integrated weed management. The other thing you can see here is that there is a kind of a north-south gradient in when you look on the participating countries, and that was also deliberate because when we look on agriculture in Europe, I mean, really the important gradient is north-south in terms of how we grow our crops, what type of crops we grow, whereas the differences from east to west are less. As you can see, actually from 17 to 2022, and it had a budget from the EU of 7 million euros. Well, the objectives of IWMPRAISE, and I'll not spend too much time on that because that will become clear when I go through my presentation. But actually, what we tried to do, because even though this was back in 2017 that this project started, I mean, we had been talking at that time about integrated weed management, integrated pest management for quite a long time. And I think there was a common agreement that there hadn't been a lot of progress in Europe when it came to the uptake of integrated weed management and integrated pest management. So what we wanted to do as a very, very first step in this project was really to address the barriers to the uptake of integrated weed management and including, I mean, any perceived economic losses, but also generally any kind of general resistance to changes. So that was the first step, and that was going to form more or less the basis for how we were going to develop the project afterwards. But then, of course, a very important objective was also to develop alternative weed control measures and optimize their efficacy, applicability, and also look very much into how we could combine these different methods into integrated weed management strategies. And the third objective was then to demonstrate or to assess the economic and the environmental performance of these new IWM strategies and management scenarios. Now that part is even if a project runs for 5 years, as we all know, I mean, weed management is a long-term effort, and demonstrating the impact of weed management can be very difficult within a relatively short time interval. So that part of the project was mainly dealt with from a modeling approach. And then, of course, dissemination and trying to make an outreach and make an impact and produce a lot of educational material that could be used for training programs and so on was another very, very. If we take one step back and just look on the life cycle of a weed, I mean, you should think that weed management is very simple because compared to most life cycles of diseases and pests, the life cycle of a weed is really very, very simple. I mean, we do have a soil seed bank in cases of annual weeds. In cases of perennial weeds, we have a bank of rhizomes, of roots, or any other kind of surviving plant material. But that is basically the starting point for any weeds. And then some of these weeds which will establish, and they will eventually, in the case of annual weeds, produce seeds, and some of these seeds will be returned to the soil seed bank. So basically, talking about integrated weed management, I mean, there are three steps in the life cycle where we can interfere, and that is trying to prevent the establishment of the weeds, trying to reduce the impact of weeds on the crop, and try to reduce seed return, and in that way minimize over the long term the soil seed bank, and in this way minimize weed problems in the field. So from that point of view, it looks relatively simple. Now, when we start to look on the different tools that we have available, it becomes a little bit more complicated because we have a variety of different tools available to interfere in these three steps of the life cycle of the weeds. And really, when it comes to developing integrated weed management strategies, what it's all about is combining some of these tools into effective strategies. And again, trying to develop an integrated and sustainable and robust strategy, you'll probably have to combine some of these methods so that you not just interfere in one step of the life cycle, but that you interfere in more steps of the life cycle. The other thing is that many of these tools, I mean, if we forget about the herbicides, many of these tools that could replace herbicides are relatively ineffective as a standalone method compared to herbicides. So this is also why when we're talking about integrated weed management, this term, which was developed by Liebman and Galland back in '97, about the many little hammers which are necessary to develop integrated weed management strategies, are very, very relevant here. And this, of course, is what makes integrated weed management quite complicated, because you need to combine many different methods. And also, these strategies are context specific. I mean, it's not the same strategy in different crops in different parts of the world. Even within a country, there might be a need for different strategies on certain soil types compared to other soil types. So integrated weed management is very context specific, but still, of course, there are some general principles that you can explore in a project like IWMPRAISE. One of the things which is nice about weed management is that it is more generic than disease and pest management. Often for disease and pest management, there's a very, very clear connection between crop and pest and diseases. And this is not the same for weed management. For weed management, we very much rely not on a specific crop, but on, for example, the spatial arrangement of a crop. And that was something we exploited in this project by basically saying, okay, we will in this project work with 4 different groups of crops. We divided them into the annual drill crops in narrow rows, the annual drill crops in wide rows, perennial herbaceous crops, and perennial woody crops. And then our belief was that what we develop in an annual drill crops in wide rows in Northern Europe might also be of relevance in an annual drill crops in Southern Europe, even though we may be talking about maize in Netherlands and Denmark, and about soybeans in Italy, because the spatial arrangement of the crops are the same, and some of the tools that we can apply will be the same. So this was a general approach that we used in this project, was to basically categorize our crops into 4 groups. And most of our work was in narrow row crops, wide row crops, and perennial woody crops. In perennial herbaceous crops, weed problems are less pronounced, but we did have some activities here on biological control of perennial weeds. Now, in each of the participating countries, we formed what we called national clusters, consisting of relevant stakeholders. And that was one of the reasons why the number of partners was relatively high. So we had a national cluster for each of the different groups that we were working on in each of the participating countries. And the national clusters were involved in designing and evaluating the IWM strategies that we were developing. Because, I mean, as it turned out, also from the first part of the project where we were asking about the barriers, we realized that it is very, very important that those who are going to apply integrated weed management strategies are also involved in the development of these strategies. But I'll come back to that a little bit later, how it works in practice. Just this general overview about how the project was organized. We had a work package for each of the crop categories, and that is what is shown in the horizontal columns. And then we had some cross-cutting work packages which were covering all 4 crop categories. Like, for example, we had an innovation hub that was work package 2, where we were working with some of the ideas for some of the IWM tools, which was not mature for application at the beginning of the project, but hopefully could be mature for application during the lifetime of the project. So that was a kind of an innovation hub where we worked with new tools. Then we had also a work package dealing specifically with this soil conservation. I mean, everybody knows that there's this trade-off between soil conservation and weed management, and this is also important to address. And then, of course, work package 8, where we were doing this more modeling approach to try to estimate or to assess the long-term response of changing these weed management strategies. And with that, I'll come back to the work package 1, because that was the one I mentioned when I mentioned the objectives, that the starting point of this project was really to try to study what is the barriers for the uptake of integrated weed management. And in this project here, we called it mental modeling. And therefore, the title of work package 1 were mental models. And this is an example of an outcome of the mental modeling. What we did was that we, as a very first initiative in the project were conducting focus group interviews with farmers and advisors primarily, and asking them about what their imagination and their ideas were about integrated weed management. And this is an example of how you could picture the outcome of such an focus group interview. So basically, the size of the bubbles here indicate how many times this tool was mentioned by farmers or advisors as a part of an integrated weed management tool. And the colors that we put on is relating back to the life cycle, weed life cycle I showed you before. So the gray referred to something which reduced the impact of weeds on crops, the orange which reduced seed return, and the green something which reduce or prevent establishment of the crops. And then we tried, or those who conducted these focus group interviews tried to organize it into some overriding themes like diverse cropping systems, cultivar choice, field soil management, targeted control, and monitoring and evaluation. And this was somehow the starting point for developing the IWM strategies that we were going to test in the project. And as you will see later on, this framework here is really very much reflected in one of the most significant output of this project that I'm going to present at the end of my presentation. Now, the way we worked in the project by involving the stakeholders was that basically what we did in each of these crop work packages was that we sat down with the stakeholders and designed IWM strategies. So we got the input from the stakeholders. How could you imagine IWM strategies to look? And of course, the idea was to make sure that we did not suggest our researchers did not suggest any kind of tools which was seen as considered as completely unrealistic to use in practical farming. So with these IWM strategies, we then went into the field and we did our first season testing of the strategies, and then again with the stakeholders, we made an evaluation of these different strategies. And then, if needed, we made an adjustment of the IWM strategies. If not, we repeated what we did in the first year and the second year. But if we needed an adjustment, we made an adjustment of the IWM strategies. And then we went on to the second season of field trials with these adjusted IWM strategies. And the same thing then happened after the second season to the third season. So we were in a lucky position in this project because it was designed as a 5-year project that we had 3 field seasons in the project. Of course, this meant that in some cases we did different trials in the different field seasons. And that, of course, for us as researchers posed a problem because then, as you all know, if you don't repeat your experiments, then it might be difficult actually to publish some of your outcomes in these traditional agronomy journals. But on the other hand, the main purpose here was somehow to develop strategies which could be adapted in practice, and developing strategies which have no interest among practitioners is of very little value when it comes to change weed management in the EU. So with that description of how we worked, I would like to focus now on the outcome of the of our project. And I mean, there's a website, and the website is still alive, and you can find it at this address. And everything what I'm going to show you now in terms of publications and other outputs is available on our website. So there you can actually explore and find more information about the project. Now, first, as Evelyn already mentioned, one of the outcomes was this book on advances in integrated weed management, which I got the chance to edit this book during the lifetime of the project. And in that, many of the chapters in that book is actually written by participants in the IWMPRAISE projects, where they actually describe the research activities that they are involved in. There are also chapters which are of more general nature, but here you will actually be able to find a lot of the description of a lot of the activities of the project. And then there was, of course, several papers published in peer-reviewed journals. Even though it might be difficult to publish some of the actual results from our field experiments because of the way that we conducted them. I mean, there's a lot of publications on some of the modeling work which was done as part of the project. And I would like to highlight this one publication here, which was the main author was Marlene Riemens from Wageningen University. But this is actually where we describe the IWM tool, which is more or less, you may say, where we are trying to compile all the work we did in IWMPRAISE into an online tool that can be used for developing or designing IWM strategies. But I will come back to that. First, I will say that, I mean, it's not that all our field experiments has not been reported. You will find on the website this publication, which is now ended up being a 250-page publication, where all the field trials that we conducted in IWMPRAISE has been described. It was a kind of a living document where it was the new experiments were added every year. So it's organized by country and by year. And there you can find very detailed descriptions about the experiments containing tables and figures and pictures showing the different activities of the activities. This is more specifically a description of experiments in sugar beets conducted in Denmark. And as you can see on the picture to the right, that here we also had some mechanical weed management involved in the testing, and that was in the last year. And this is actually a good example of what I mentioned, that this concept here, this is a mechanical weeding tool based on sensing, which has been developed by a small producer in Denmark. When the project started, this was part of the work in the Innovation Hub. But then gradually we developed on this tool together with the innovator. And then at the end of the project, it was actually included in some of our strategies that we were testing. So this is an example of how things move from the Innovation Hub into the practical testing. And as you can see, this is mechanical weeding, and basically there are two tools here. One is that you can do it mechanically by these pins, which moves in and out between the crops, but you can also do it with very, very targeted flaming of the weeds. And it's all, of course, cameras, which is able to determine where do you have the crops and where do you have the weeds. Now, another output of IWMPRAISE was inspiration sheets. So these are, as you might say, short descriptions of some of the IWM tools that can be applied, and they are very much seen as a kind of, as the title indicate, a kind of inspiration to farmers and advisors, maybe to try to take up the idea, try to test the idea. So here you will find a short description about how you do this in practice, what you should be aware of if you, for example, engage in some kind of mechanical weed control, and what are the opportunities and what are the challenges and limitations to the different technologies. So these inspiration sheets are also available on our website. And we also have a more specific description, which was then, I mean, the inspiration sheets were developed in the beginning of the project, most of them. These inventory of IWM tools were developed at the end of the project, where we have a more concrete description of some of these tools that can be used for integrated weed management. And basically, I mean, the way that we have done it, we have tried to organize these descriptions in the same way. So this is basically the headlines that you see here. And this is some examples of how you can find it. They are all one-page descriptions of these different tools. And as you can see, we have a kind of a classification of the tools. So, I mean, the number of tractors indicate the readiness for use. So the highest is 5 tractors. So here we do have examples of 2 technologies which we see as ready to be used by farmers. And then it's the same for efficacy. Again, you can have up to 5 of these years. And in this cases, we have 4 years for each of these activities. So these are relatively effective alternative IWM tools that can be part of an IPM strategy. Of course, some of these tool sheets also describes technologies which might be less well developed. And here's one for allelopathic cover crops for field vegetables. And here again, you can see the number of tractors are 3 and efficacy are somewhat lower. But again, you again find these 34 different tools which have been described in this relatively simple way, and hopefully can serve as a kind of inspiration for farmers and advisors to take up some of these ideas. And you can see in the bottom of these tool sheets that there are also links to where you can find much more information about the tools. Now, field days, of course, was part of the project also. So we had organized field days in all the countries. We were also present on the social media, and we were present on all social medias. And again, some of the information which is available there is also is of course still available, and especially some of the videos that we could upload from some of the demonstrations of some of the mechanical tools, of course, are very valuable, because I mean, one picture tells much more than 1,000 words if you want to demonstrate some of these activities. Now, with that, I'm coming to the what we call the IWM tool, which, we see in the project, we see this very much as a compilation of all the information that we did collect during the project. And this is an online tool, and you can find a link here. I will not go online here to demonstrate it, because there's often a tendency to that doesn't work as you expect. So here I just have some screenshots of how it works. And as you can see, the structure you see here are quite similar to the structure that was designed during the mental modeling exercise. So it's very much the same approach that we're using here. The monitoring part is now put in the middle of the circle rather than being one of 5 components on the circle. But again, we have these 4 components here: cultivar choice and establishment, field and soil management, direct control, and diverse cropping systems. And then for each of them, we have a number of hexagons where some of these tools that can be applied are mentioned. And again, they have different colors, and these colors refer to the 3 steps in the life cycle of weeds. And what you can do here is that you can make a choice. You can make a choice between perennial crops, because between these narrow row crops and broad row crops, and for each of these 3 crops, you can make a choice between annual weeds and perennial weeds. And now what you're seeing on the screen now is narrow crops and annual weeds. And as you can see, all the hexagons are actually filled. And if you press one of these hexagons, you will actually, there's a link to a description of, or to further information about, for example, sowing depths and sowing dates. Now, if you put in perennial weeds and perennial crops, as I've done here, you will see that some of these hexagons becomes invisible, because, I mean, sowing date is not an issue or a potential tool any longer, for example, when you're talking perennial crops and perennial weeds. So of course here you have less options, but again, if you press the hexagons here, you will find information about that specific tool. And this is the kind of information that you will find if you press, in this case, about sowing dates, where you will find something about how it can be applied, the efficacy, the cost, equipment, and so on. And again, the idea is to provide some more background information for those who are interested. But we see this IWM tool very much as really an educational tool, which can be used really to inform anyone who is any practitioners who is doing integrated weed management on the possibilities, the options that you have. And then, of course, as I said in the beginning, integrated weed management is extremely context specific. So some of these hexagons might be completely irrelevant for some farmers. As we know, for example, that mechanical weeding like harrowing and so on is not a solution on a soil where you have a lot of stones, for example. So there's so many very specific things you need to consider when you put together this strategy. But with a number of options, I'm sure that in most cases you could be able to design an integrated weed management strategy in most fields and in most crops. So with that, I will finish my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions on this project and on integrated weed management in general. And just showing you here the last slide, which is a list of basically pictures all the partners which were involved in IWMPRAISE. So thank you very much for attending the webinar.
Thank you very much to you, Professor Kudsk, for this fantastic, insightful presentation. And indeed, I went into the website and I explored, and it's so rich. It's so full of tools that people can explore. And definitely with the final tool that you showed, they will be able to narrow down what strategies to use in the different, depending on the field, on the latitude, etc. It's very interesting. Um, I was like, while people are typing their questions in the chat section and the Q&A section, I have a question. So these all of these resources, so they're still in the website. Is 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 there a plan to kind of like put them available? If the website is the website going to be available for some other year? That's it is so much effort. It seems like such a
Yeah.
pity that it goes inactive and then people won't have access.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very important question, and this is something that we very soon has to look into how we ensure that. Because personally, I think that we should maintain the website, but as you know, we only obliged to obtain it 5 years after the end of the project,
Yeah.
and we're getting close to that point now. But I would very much like to maintain it, or if not able to maintain it, then put all the information into, for example, the website of Aarhus University. Now, I should say that the IWM tool is hosted by Wageningen University, so that will be available forever.
Mm-hmm.
And on the website, you will actually be able you actually find similar tools developed for disease and pest management also. So the idea of this framework, applying it to not only to weeds but also to other pests, has actually been further developed by the people at Wageningen. So the tool will be available, but a lot of the other information, somehow we need to ensure that it will be available for the future also.
Yeah, definitely. So this project finished around 2022. You mentioned that it was extended because of COVID. So have subsequent projects extended the result, like including maybe other countries? Like, do you have like spin-off uh, projects that derive from this one and explore other things?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I mean, I think there are three projects right now which deals with integrated weed management, and I try to follow them on the website. But some of them some of these projects have. I mean, you may say that our project, we try to have a relatively general approach, trying to cover all crops, trying to cover all of Europe, because that was basically what was in the call text. So we needed to have a relatively broad approach. I can see some of the projects which has been started up are much more specific now. They look much more into the application of new tools like drones and also much more into the use of sensors and robots and so on. So you could say that they are kind of a follow-up, and they probably point towards the future that we think will come. But I still think that a lot of the data which is available on our webpage and a lot of data that we generated in our project is still very, very relevant and could still be implemented in practice, because, I mean, the situation hasn't changed a lot in European agriculture. I mean, integrated pest management, and maybe specifically integrated weed management, is not something which has been adopted by many farmers. And herbicides still seems to be the main tool in most cases, and it is often seen as an almost standard practice in farming practice, in conventional farming practice today, to a much higher extent than, for example, the use of insecticides. So I think the information which is available in our project could still make a big difference in practical farming. But of course, robots, drones, and all these kind of technologies will take it even further when it comes to integrated weed management.
Okay, we have a question here. It says, can these IWM tool be extrapolated to design strategies for other countries outside Europe, like Africa or South America?
I think as a minimum, it can serve as an inspiration in any situation. But I mean, we also have to be aware that some of the crops that are grown, if we move to Africa or to Asia, are very different from the crops that we have focused on in our project. And therefore, if you also noticed, I mean, the paper that we produced on the IWM tool, we call it a pan-European perspective. Because, I mean, that is where we have worked, that's the experience that we have. But I think in many ways, weed management, I mean, there's so many generic elements about weed management that I'm sure that this could also at least serve as an inspiration in other parts of the world.
Yeah, definitely. It's a framework of as a
Yeah,
methodology. How did you
yeah.
approach each like
But I'm sure that
each?
if you take some of the crops in Africa and Asia, then it would be relevant to add more hexagons that would
Yeah.
be of relevance in those countries, but were not of relevance in Europe, for example.
Yeah, definitely. Some people are asking about the sharing the results. I have put the websites in the chat section, so you can take a note of the websites that Professor could also share in his presentation, so you can explore all the elements in the website. Um, so what do you think could be like the key policy recommendations that you would think could emerge from this project? Um, yeah, because we all know that like the projects, but then it has to go towards like policy and how to manage um all of these tools and kind of provide to the farmers. What do you think policy recommendations could come out from your project?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think generally, I mean, there's no doubt that maybe I'm a weed scientist, of course, but and I'm speaking from with that background. But I think that maybe changing the practices when it comes to weed management might be the most difficult one compared to insect and diseases, because in many cases you do have more. I mean, in many cases you can actually substitute one method by another method. And of course, yeah, I think specifically about crop resistance, for example, when we are talking diseases. And for weed management, the complication is that you often need to combine different strategies to get an effect which is comparable to the effect of a herbicide. But I think an important message is that, I mean, there are possibilities of doing that, but I think you need to. I think that there are several things needed. I mean, first of all, demonstrating these integrated weed management strategies is a very, very important part. And I think if you look around if you look in the peer-reviewed literature and so on, there are actually relatively few examples of good long-term studies where people have been testing integrated weed management strategies and looked into the not only the effect but also the economics of these integrated strategies. So I think what we need is many more demonstration activities where we actually over several years try to look into the effect of the demonstration activities. And then I also think we just have to realize that integrated weed management is much more complicated than just applying herbicides. So either we need to educate our farmers, or we need to provide them with some kind of advisory service or support. And now I'm involved in another project, support, which actually also looks into some of the barriers of integrated pest management. And there's no doubt that what farmers are asking for is actually support in terms of advisory service and more information. And in some countries, this works very nicely. There's a good setup to support farmers to move in the right direction. But in other countries, this is not the case. I mean, advisory service is very fragmented, or you don't have an independent advisory service because some of the people who are involved in advisory service, they also sell pesticides.
Mm.
So the independency of advisory services also, but I mean, this knowledge transfer together with some demonstrations or good examples of how it could actually work is probably what is mostly needed. But then, of course, we all need to continue to do the research and continue to uh, involve some of the more advanced tools for the future. And I just saw that popped up a question about cost. And that, of course, is one of the limitations here, is that in many cases, herbicides are the cheapest solution. And integrated weed management strategies are often more costly in terms of investments in the tools that you need, or investment in labor, the time required to do integrated weed management, because the capacity of a big sprayer, I mean, you cannot reach that capacity with any of these alternative tools. So there is a cost issue here also. But of course, there are also some savings, and some farmers are spending a lot of money on herbicides, especially if they're facing problems with resistance and so on. And I've seen several cases where if you sit down and do the calculations, then actually the differences are not that big if you are among the farmers who are having the highest use of herbicides due to, for example, problems with specific weed species or herbicide resistance. But we would like the farmers to change to integrate weed management strategies before they hit the wall. And that is unfortunately what we're seeing now, when they cannot handle weeds with herbicides any longer, then they are much more open to alternative practices. But we would like that change to happen a little bit earlier.
So have now that we're talking about farmers and adoption of the strategies, have any of the strategies that you develop been maybe widely adopted in a farm or for advisory services?
I think the advisory service has taken up many of the ideas here. I mean, things like delaying sowing, fall seedbed, and so on is very often recommended by advisors as a tool to minimize weed problems, to minimize herbicide use, and so on. But the step really to go to, I mean, not just to apply one or two tools, but to develop strategies and apply these strategies, maybe even without the intention to use herbicides. I mean, you may, at the end of the day, I mean, herbicides will continue to be the last resort. So if you cannot control the weeds, then of course you still have the herbicides to help you. But developing a strategy which as a starting point, do not include herbicides. I mean, we're not there yet. But individual tools, of the many tools that we have described, you can see some of these tools are quite popular and are recommended, but still in combination with herbicides. So we need to take the next step.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Professor Kudsk, thank you very much for attending our webinar today and for giving like a big kind of a broad overview of how of your project and then all the tools that people can access and explore. Now is 9:46. I have to start closing the webinar. So I
Okay.
want just to tell you everyone that our next webinar is going to be in June 4th, and I'm going to send the invitation to everyone in the coming days. In that webinar, we're going to have Dr. Shamina Patan from the University of Florence in Italy. She's going to give our second talk in the agroecology crop series, and she's going to be talking about legume cereal intercropping for sustainable agriculture across Europe. Her project is called Leguminous, and I hope to see everyone there. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you for your questions, and thank you so much, Professor Kutsk, once again, for accepting our invitation.
You're
Goodbye.
welcome.
Thank
Bye bye.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.